Nine Witches Family Disruption is a 2D pixel art action-adventure game set during World War II, where the mysterious Occult SS division is using an evil curse in a desperate attempt to change the course of the war. As you explore over 60 colorful and beautiful pixel art style locations, you will encounter over 40 characters with a range of entertaining, humorous personalities, which can be crude, sympathetic, gloomy, or sarcastic, but always bizarre. It's a single-player game with dual character control. You'll be able to switch between Professor Krakowitz, who is confined to a wheelchair, but able to commune with the dead, and his Japanese assistant Akiro, who are sent undercover to resolve the supernatural phenomena occurring in the rural Norse town. Akiro collects interesting items to store in the inventory and takes notes about objectives and clues. Professor Krakowitz gets goosebumps and a blue aura around his body when he senses the presence of spirits and is able to enter the astral plane, an invisible world between life and death. There he is able to communicate with lost souls to gather further information that will help solve the case. The game is full of puzzle-solving elements that involve sneaking into enemy territory in disguise, solving riddles, finding clues, and missing keys hidden inside mystical artifacts, and many more well-known adventure game mechanics like Western-style standoffs and gunfights.
Should a party member be willing to die for the cause? I think whether they're willing to die is irrelevant. Are they able to die for the cause? Don't underestimate that by itself, because then they can die for the cause unrelated to their willingness, and that is much, much more flexible. I'm not advocating the death of party members before their time. By and large, a coworker is much more valuable when still alive, most of the time. But like so many things, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. And don't forget, in most cases, a cause is unsympathetic to how it is achieved. If the party's goal was to save someone's life, that person might want to say something about it before the party takes action. For example, if you had to imprison 1,000 people in Avernus to save one person, they might say, "Don't put yourself out on my account. I like it down here." It seems bad until you actually show up, and then it's pretty cool. The kind of quests we get are about kidnapped dignitaries or trade disputes. But if the cause is for real clarity, real meaning, the inner workings of the universe, that is worth dying for. It's worth me dying for. And whether or not you agree, it's worth you dying for. Probably first. I am just trying to make the point. If you're seeking forbidden knowledge that can't be obtained with non-occult methods, you don't want to hesitate in the moment with ethics. A wise, long-storied drow philosopher once said, "I'm not giving away my shot." If you had one shot, would you take it or just let it slip? That's from the Book of Lolth. Lolth is a spider goddess they made me worship for a while.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this talk brought to you by Latinx in Games. Um, this shouldn't be a surprise if you're here, but if you are, let me give you a little background. This talk is going to be me going over the history of Latinx game characters, and then kind of following up with where do we think we can go next with that idea. Um, so let's talk. Let me just quickly give you some background on me and who I work for and why I'm here. So I am a co-founder of Latinx in Gaming. Latinx in Gaming is a pretty cool advocacy group that works within the gaming space to help support, promote, and increase diversity within games and also within the gaming industry itself. It was founded in 2017 and it's now a nonprofit. If you want to check out the things that we do, which are really cool, you can go to latinxingaming.com. Also, we have a Twitch channel, which you should check out at the end of the stream. What I'm going to try and do is be live on that stream when this happens because I'm pre-recording this whole thing. And what I'll do is I'll be able to answer your questions there on stream. So it's twitch.tv/Latinx in Games. You should come hang out with us. I'll put a link in chat. Probably I'll be lurking. But anyway, hi, what's up? Good to see you. About me, my name is Joe Torado. I'm the comms and marketing lead at Systemera Softworks. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm the co-founder of Latinx in Games. And before this, I worked in all sorts of industries doing creative stuff. So working in movies and television and the graphic design world, working at creative agencies, making content. So I have a good background in a lot of different things. And I've been in games now for about 5 years or so. Okay, cool. So what we're going to cover today, we want to go through the major sort of inflection points in the history of games and call out points where Latinx game characters are there. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of those. And then talk about some major milestones within the history of Latinx in game characters. This isn't going to be an exhaustive list. I wish I had the time to really go through and pick out every single game character, but that's just not possible within the scope of what we're doing here today. And we're going to talk about some good and bad examples and why they're good and why they're bad, and kind of go in between and figure out and pull out the good stuff while also being honest about what isn't working necessarily with some of these characters. Okay, so some background that'll be, I think, helpful for everyone. The math. So just popular culture type stuff. 20% of moviegoers are Latinx. That means 1 in 4 people who are buying a movie ticket in North America are actually Latinx descent, which is crazy to think about. 18% of the U.S. population is Latinx, which is, I don't think, a surprise. We're the second largest group of people that live here. And then just another sort of thing here, 397 million gamers in Latin America. So that's a lot of people. I'm sure there's many millions in the United States and across the world. So something to be thinking about. Unfortunately, with all this math, we aren't actually represented at all. I mean, you can read up on statistics about our representation in games, in popular media, in movies and television shows, and it is abysmal. It's awful. So let's talk about what good representation looks like. Unfortunately, I wanted to pull some examples, but there's just not a lot of them. They don't exist. I know there are characters, but I just mean I don't have a plethora of them to choose from. So what I think good representation means, and an important way to define it, is good representation is free of stereotypes. So people are not you're not reducing people down to their basest form in order to present it. Especially when you're talking about the next point on here, which is the diversity within Latinx. So I'm Colombian, but I'm also Puerto Rican, and I grew up in the United States. My version of Latinx is going to look way different than someone who is Colombian and Puerto Rican but grew up in Puerto Rico or grew up in Colombia. And so there's a humongous amount of diversity within Latinx cultures, even within countries of Latinx. I mean, it's a wide variety of people, and so sometimes I don't even like necessarily using a term like Latinx or Latino or Latina, because you are basically bucketing a lot of people together who don't always reconcile with each other. And I mean that in a way of just like they're just going to have completely different interests and needs. The needs of someone who is born in the United States, who is went to American schools, is going to be completely different than the needs of someone who grew up in Puerto Rico and experienced that school infrastructure. So just something to be thinking about. Like within regions and countries, you're seeing different cultures and customs. And then so for a good representation, most characters that you want to see that represent you or you can put yourself into, they have a purpose beyond tokenism. And what we're going to see a lot of is tokenism and options, right? Like there are only Latinx characters because they just needed more options, and this was a way to add more variation to a game. But they're not necessarily core to the experience. They're just there as a way to give you a bigger menu, which is not really cool and not what you want. And then also what you want for good representation is characters that are grounded in reality. So people who have actual real motives that match up with things that you're into, or people who are written in a way that doesn't just like focus on their Latinx-ness and nothing else, which I think happens quite a bit, unfortunately. That we want characters with depth that feel real, that feel like they're grounded in the Latinx experience, which can be very wide and shouldn't be boiled down to the sort of tropes that we're seeing very often. We don't want to be another option in a fighter list or a character choice screen. We want to be there, contributing to the story, and doing so in a meaningful way. So stereotypes. This is one of the biggest things that characters of the pitfalls of a Latinx character, if you're writing one or if you are putting one in your game or if you're playing as one. Unfortunately, there are these existing stereotypes that kind of tread the same ground very often, and what ends up happening is because that ground gets treaded, people who aren't necessarily exposed to Latinx people or people who aren't necessarily exposed to Latinx culture don't explore it anymore in order to come up with cool new versions of ways to represent Latinx characters, which then means that people don't even try, right? They go, oh, well, we can't do the luchador thing, we can't do the drug dealer thing, and we can't do the sexy lady thing, so we're just not going to put a Latinx character in there at all. Which, if you're writing game characters or if you are creating games with Latinx characters in them, I challenge you to come up with more interesting ways to represent the game characters in a way that just doesn't walk in these same paths, because it's tired, it's busted. Like no one is into this kind of stuff. That's not to say that luchador culture is bad. I don't think it's bad, but I think unfortunately in popular culture it has been treated so similarly that people are looking at it and say, why even do this? Okay, so why are they harmful? They take away your agency as a person of Latinx descent, right? You start to look at those things and you feel like everyone who looks at you, or if you identify with Latinx culture, that people are just going to look at you and prescribe those tropes and those stereotypes to you with you not even doing anything but just existing. They perpetuate harmful ideas, right? They're putting ideas out in the world that are not good, but also like can be dangerous to like you and how people view you in the world. So they can be more than just hurtful. They can be super harmful to you in a way that is pretty scary. And then also I fall into this trap where everyone sort of has this point of reference about Latinx people, and then you just like fall into the trap of like living that life or towing the line that is previously there, because that's all people know, and you don't even want to spend the time to try and like expose them to other parts of your culture, because they're just going to brand you as sombrero or this or that, which is like super treaded ground. So they're really bad, and we should try and eliminate them as much as possible. Okay, so let's go back. I just like this GIF. It doesn't really have anything to do with what we're showing off right now. Pardon me, need some coffee. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a quick crash course in video game history. You could spend many hours talking about what is happening on this timeline between 1965 to 1980. We're gonna breeze through it, but I think it's important to talk about, especially because when you talk about representation, I mean, you're talking about 15, 20 years passing, and there's just like literally none. I'll let you off the hook there. Between 1970 and 1980 plus, there is no representation of Latinx characters. It's partially due to the medium, so I'll get into that. So before 1970, video games are mostly distributed between high level thinkers, people who have big computers at their schools, researchers. They're using the processing power to create games. I think the first game that you might think of as far as the modern gaming industry comes in 1971/1970 in Pong. It's an arcade cabinet, it's a co-op game. Games existed before this, but not video games, right? Before this and during this time and all throughout this time, you're still seeing people play pinball machines and other arcade things. They just don't play games. And so in 1971, Pong comes out, changes all that. It's a video game. It's what you would consider a video game today. In 1972, the first video game console comes out, and that is the Magnavox Odyssey. So unfortunately, this console is basically just a Pong for your home. It's got that little controller, and you spin the wheels to move your paddles, but that's about it. It doesn't do anything else. It doesn't swap out. It just plays Pong, but it's a Pong home machine. So some really cool stuff happens. 1976, 1978 are when some of the most important, like the video game industry and the video game console industry, go through these like iterations where, you know, it's about arcade cabinets, then it's maybe about consoles, then it's maybe about you know, like they kind of swap and switch around. But in 76, Breakout comes out, and that's like a huge success for Atari and kind of establishes them as like as a mainstay in the industry. They'd already been doing stuff. And then in 1978, Space Invaders comes out, and this is one of the first games that kind of does things that modern games do, which is like records a score, it has lives, and it's tracking those. It has different levels. It's kind of doing some stuff that like previously hadn't necessarily been thought about before. And then in 1979, Pac-Man comes out, and that's where you start to actually see video game characters, where you start to see franchises being built around specific characters in games. And I think actually in 1980 as well, like right after Pac-Man, that's when like the first Donkey Kong game comes out, which is the one with Mario climbing the ladders. So you start to actually see franchises appearing and characters being put out there. 1980 is the first handheld. You know, so you're seeing a lot of advancements in video games, but none of this stuff is happening within Latinx culture. None of it is being really, a lot of it's not really being produced by Latinx people. It's usually Japanese or you know, people with access to certain kinds of technology. So we're going to jump forward from, so you got the little crash course, you know where the lay of the land is. You got some video game consoles existing. You have arcade games still being really popular. You have video games starting to become a thing that rely on character development. And then in 1982, this happens. So at this point, the Atari 2600, I think, has been out for a year, maybe more. And this is one of the first video game consoles that is like what you would think of today. It's got multiple games. You swap them in and out. You plug it into your TV. And for my money, the first, I guessed, representation of Latinx culture within video games looks like this. So yeah, you know, 12, 16 pixels on a screen, on a pitch. And I wouldn't necessarily call this representation, but we'll get into that more later. But this is actually where the Latinx people kind of get involved in the gaming industry. And I think it's no surprise that it has to do with football. So, yeah, Pele Soccer comes out in 1982, and it's one of the first games that actually includes the likeness of a person in order to sell it. So I'll just give you a little a little taste of what that
At
looks like.
Atari, our game cartridges undergo grueling tests. We put Kareem Abdul-Jabbar up against Atari basketball.
Oh, man, what a move.
We let Mario Andretti test drive Atari Night Driver.
This game really cracks me up.
And the great Pele himself tested Pele's championship soccer.
What a gig, it beats me again.
At Atari, we take our games seriously, so you have more fun.
How'd you do, Kareem?
Glad I won't face Atari in the playoffs.
No other video game company
Look
stacks
at how much taller he was than both of them. So as you can see here, it's an ad calling out the fact that like they got multiple games in different genres. They got 40 of them, and you plug them in there. So for my money, this is actually where Latinx people get involved in video games, and people see how Latinx characters can actually be really beneficial. Unfortunately, at this point, most video game characters are like literally just box art, and then you play some pixels and you kind of put your mind in there. But it still is a pretty interesting one to call out, because I think it's a theme that we'll talk about later. It kicks off a theme that I'll talk about later. So the verdict on Pele as a video game character. Pele is cool. He's one of the most well-known people on the planet at this point. I mean, everyone knows who the guy is, and that's actually really cool that they showcase him for this thing. Unfortunately, I don't think he counts as the first video game character, because it's like just a square on a screen, and there was no like name, there's nothing. It was literally like, if you saw the gameplay, it's like 3 players moving around and you're just bouncing the ball in between them. You're just kind of ping-ponging it back and forth. But I do think it's an important step, and something that will be kind of play into some stuff that happens later. So in 1982, we're staying in the same year, this happens. So like I mentioned, arcade cabinets are still doing their thing. They're still out there, and Nintendo, a little company called Nintendo, puts out this cabinet, which is Punch-Out. And Punch-Out is if you're not aware, it's a boxing fighting game. It was re-released many times. It's been on many Nintendo consoles, but I'm pretty sure this is the first iteration of it. And yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think actually, for my money, the first time you see a Latinx game character in a game where you could see them and understand who they are and understand their identity is in Punch-Out. And the name of that character is Piston Hurricane from Cuba. So I actually really like this character. Piston Hurricane is an Afro-Latino from Cuba. He's a fighter in the game that's like they're not relying on any weird tropes or anything. If you've ever played some of the later Punch-Out games, they lean heavily into some terrible stereotypes. The dialogue is so sketchy. Like, some of that stuff is super cringy right now when you watch it and kind of go like, oh man, what are they doing? Like, Piston Hurricane in Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and later versions of Punch-Out changes over to Piston Honda, who's a Japanese fighter who has like, you know, the physical features are super exaggerated and the lines he says are really bad. It's just like really not great writing. Sorry, Nintendo. But Piston Hurricane, the original, is pretty cool. You know, he's got the afro, he's got the curly hair, which is actually really interesting, right? You wouldn't necessarily you wouldn't think about that at this time, especially considering the other game that we just showed off. But yes, in later versions, Piston Hurricane, when they kind of redid him, he even gets darker and gets a super awesome afro hawk thing that like wraps around the back. And they did play on words here. They, you know, Nintendo likes to do the puns. And what they're basically saying is Piston Hurricane is from Cuba, and his whole thing is like the hurricane rush, right? Because like Cuba gets hurricanes because it's in the South Atlantic. Yeah, I don't think it's super problematic considering some of the other tropes that are in these games, but he's got a good record. He's young. He doesn't have any like weird idiosyncrasies that are just like based solely on the fact that he's you know, an Afro-Latino character. So I actually think, for the first one, for what I'm sort of looking at it, I think this is actually pretty good. Piston Hurricane rules, and I'm happy that they didn't lean into some really questionable stuff from Cuba, right? Like, they could have done something with communism and like had it be weird. No, they didn't do any of that. He's just a good fighter, and he's like the second or third fighter that you face, and he doesn't say any weird stuff. So I'm actually happy with this one. Okay, now we're going to jump ahead a bit more. So lots of things are happening in video games at this point. In 1982, you also see the release of the Commodore 64, which is one of the most popular PCs ever created. I think they sold the most out of all computer systems ever. Widely distributed, has a ton more processing power and some really cool games. For what I like from my research, the video game characters you see on there that are of Latinx descent are enemies. They're people you shoot, they're people that blow up, they're not main characters, they're not protagonists. And mostly same goes for the Nintendo Entertainment System. So we're already in 1986, which is kind of crazy. If you're not aware, the Nintendo Entertainment System basically changes home consoles. It was paired with a robot called Rob for a while. I mean, there's some cool stuff there, but that's where we're at in time right now, which I think is important to think about. Like, we've already passed a ton of time in video game history, and we have maybe a handful of characters. That's not great. Okay, so next we're going to go forward a year, 1987. In 1987, Atari releases Atari RBI Baseball, which is one of the first times you see licensed players in a video game, which is actually really cool. Baseball is a sport that's played by lots of different cultures. Obviously, Central and South America are pretty well known for being good at baseball at this point, and there's a bunch of awesome players. And so the way that they did this is they didn't get the full baseball league to be sign on. It's the Players Association, which means you can put players' names in. The characters don't necessarily look like anyone. I mean, they all look very similar. They're just like this sort of regular color tan person. Everyone kind of looks white, but when they step up to bat, their name comes up. You see Barry Bonds. I think this was Barry Bonds' rookie year. You see Barry Bonds' name and you go, oh man, that's my favorite player. I get to play as him in the game. This is one of the first times that you actually see Latinx sports figures in the game by name. So players like Jose Canseco, Fernando Valenzuela, and Andres Galarraga, like, they're there and you can literally use them as your character, which is actually really cool. And they have different stats that are related to what they did in real life. And so there's a lesson there, which is like, there's just people in the world who are Latinx who do things, and you should just represent them and not have to caricaturize them in a way that cheapens their accomplishments. I mean, these are very well accomplished people who are well respected in the sport, and they're just there, which is really cool. Okay, so we're going to jump forward a couple years. We're going to 1991, and this is also the year that the SNES launches, but we've already gone through several years of the Nintendo Entertainment System. You're getting the Sega Genesis out by, having Sonic the Hedgehog. I mean, we're already on Mega Man 4, and we're talking about maybe a handful of Latinx video game characters. So we're not doing well. We're not tracking well. There are some. I'm pretty sure this is a character from Fatal Fury, one of those fighting games from that era. This is just like one of the guys you just like beat up on your way to becoming the ultimate, karate ninja person. And by this point, you've already got Street Fighter 2. So Street Fighter 1 has already run like crazy in arcades and has already made a big name for itself. And unfortunately, there is what people might consider representation in Street Fighter. I don't, but I wanted to call it out because it plays on this trope of Brazilian fighters, and that character is Blanca. So I have a lot of feels and thoughts about this. When you load up Street Fighter, they have the character select screen, and it's got the, when you go over the characters, it has the flags and it has like information about them. Blanca being listed from Brazil doesn't necessarily equal good representation for Brazil. I mean, Blanca is a green-skinned electric monster with wild hair and like a beast, like a literal beast, and that doesn't count for me. Okay, so we're jumping forward now again. 1993. This is a pretty important time for Latinx people, I think, in video games, because they're starting to make games like FIFA. So FIFA, the first FIFA comes out, which is called FIFA International Soccer. It is by EA, and it's in cahoots with FIFA. And although the players kind of look generic, as you can kind of see here, what's interesting is this actually kicks off another area where people can see themselves or play as themselves or play as their favorite clubs in a game, and not have that be dripped in, sort of steeped in weird, questionable tropes or bad stereotypes, right? They're the literal best at this worldwide thing. And so this kicks off a pretty cool thing that unfortunately takes a bit of time. If you look at something that people care about when it comes to FIFA, which is like box art, the first time you actually see a Latinx character is in 2003. So 10 years pass before you actually see yourself or see a Latinx person on the cover of this game and part of the marketing campaign. But, the first 9 years, it's just white dudes. 93 has David Platt and I always forget this guy's name. Piotr. He's got a very long last name that I won't say. Obviously, this one in 97 is David Ginola. And then you finally see Roberto Carlos in 03 alongside other people, right? Ryan Giggs. I don't even get these photos, and then Edgar Davids with the glasses, classic. Love to see that. There was other representation. I'm pretty sure there were like 2 African American characters on or players on covers before this, but this is the first time you actually see someone from South America or from Latinx culture being represented, which is cool. Unfortunately, and actually right after this, you see this pretty cool juxtaposition that happens. I think for like 4 years in a row, they just put Ronaldinho and Wayne Rooney on the cover, like back to back, like multiple years. So they're kind of talking about English football, but they're also talking about like South American style and like the juxtaposition between those two. Okay, cool. So that kind of covers the sports thing. And I think, like I said, this kicks off this idea that like soccer is actually a really good genre of video game. And once again, they're just putting the characters in, putting their names in, and not adding any other stuff. There's no tropes. The characters don't look differently or behave differently on the field. They're just like everyone else. They just happen to be Latinx. And I consider that pretty good representation because this is the best of the best in the sport. Okay, cool. So now we're going to jump ahead. And this is this is an interesting one, and we'll use this to kind of talk about just fighting game characters in general. So if anyone plays fighting games, there's this common trope of fighting games that include these sort of they're kind of bucketed into these smaller buckets. And this one's a tough one because King, I think, is a really cool character. And if you look at the backstory of King and kind of dig into it a bit more, he's based loosely on 2 people, like a Japanese wrestler, but then also a real life monk who like wrestled / like fought for the monastery that he worked in and for some orphans. And so there's some cool stuff there, and they kind of play into that with this character. But why has he got to have a cat head? I mean, if you actually play this game, it's not that he just put a mask on his head and then like that's what he does. The cat is actually moving, and the cat mouth moves, and it's part of the character. There's roaring and stuff. And so there's this weird thing where like you in your head canon, he's Latinx, but the way they choose to represent him is by him being a cat man, which is unfortunate because this could have been a really cool opportunity to explore some lore of a real person who actually did this. They have good intentions. They're virtuous. They're selfless. They don't play into super poor tropes, right? It's like a good one of like being a good person. But then then they put a cat head on there, and the cat is like kind of real, and so you're like confused and maybe a little bit scared. But unfortunately, when we talk about video game fighting characters, you actually see a good amount of representation of Latinx characters, but they are both basically just options. They, like I mentioned earlier, they're just another character on the character selection screen. And it's really unfortunate because there's actually cool things happening in fighting and in martial arts in Latin America. I mean, you're talking about like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the capoeira style and, like luchador things. Like those are deeply rooted cultural things that like people travel to explore and see, and they only get shown off by these like tropes in video games. And so it's unfortunate. I you know, it's kind of a thing now where you're like, oh, it's a luchador character, or oh, it's a Brazilian character who's doing the thing. And then also you get this super, like, when you do get women, which by the way, I just want to call out, we haven't seen any actual Latinx characters that are not men at this point that are meaningful to any story or have any agency on their own. They're just fighting game characters who are hypersexualized, which is unfortunate. So yeah, they fall into these buckets, and some might say it's cool to have them, and I do think they are, but unfortunately it creates tropes, right? It creates he's the Brazilian guy who knows how to flip around and do that thing, but they don't actually explore the culture of these characters, or the rich history of those fighting styles. They're just like, you're just another option, and you're not really central to the story at all. So yeah, like Christy Montefiero and Eddie Gordo and Laura, like, and then the characters from just all of these games, right? They just fall into these traps. And also then they get, like, there's the weird animal thing again, which is weird. So it's taking a really cool part of culture and just reducing it down to its basis form to just like add options in a game, which is sad. And one thing I want to say is, like, those cultures are really cool, and I wish that someone would explore them and actually do them justice, but no one really does. I mean, Sean is like the reduced down version of that thing, not actually adding anything interesting. He's like the brown Ryu, which is kind of sad. But yeah, anyway, I will say though, I do remember playing as Eddie in Tekken and being like, oh man, this is so cool. He does the flips but still, I wish they explored that better. Also, like Angel from Fatal Fury, just the, like, King of Fighters, like, if you look at her character sheet, she's just like super hypersexualized. I kind of hit it here, but like, she drinks tequila, she eats raw cactus, that's her favorite food, and then she plays soccer. But like, look at her. And she actually she could have been an interesting character, because she doesn't necessarily fall into like the visual tropes of Latinx characters, but they just were like, yeah, she just happens to be from Mexico and she like literally eats cactus, which is okay, cool. So we're going to stay on the fighting thing for a little bit. So now we're jumping ahead to 1996. And this is an interesting one because, wrestling games have actually been out for quite a long time. I think this is the golden age of wrestling games. And I think I put this one in here because this is actually a personal one for me, where representation actually, like, I saw this for the first time. I was playing these games. So WCW versus NWO World Tour, or Revenge, or, all of those games are arguably the best wrestling games ever shipped. And they started expanding the rosters more than they ever could. So before, it would just be like 12 wrestlers, and it's the most popular ones. And in these games, they are including everyone. I mean, they're including fighters from like Japan circuits, not just all the ones from these. So it was actually really cool. And by the way, sorry for the blur. We don't really talk about this guy anymore. He doesn't really exist to us. We just, yeah, not our thing. So the first time you see Latinx characters in one of these games, which are super popular, is in this game. So, there's some good and bad here. So, seeing Rey Mysterio and having Rey Mysterio have his moves and his style and his flair and like jumping around, like, all that stuff's really cool. He is a luchador, but like, all right, Eddie being in the game was actually really cool. But like, even these characters are problematic, right? Eddie's whole thing, his ring theme and the words he would say is like, I lie, I cheat, I steal, right? It plays into this like criminal thing, this sort of person with questionable morals. Rey Mysterio wasn't necessarily that, but I will say I will give them kudos for expanding the roster and including them. Obviously, WWE characters I don't think are going to be the sort of model for excellent representation of any culture that they display, but having them in there, I think, meant a lot to a lot of people. And I definitely played a lot of Rey Mysterio Jr. Like, he was the person that I thought was cool. So that was kind of fun. All right, so this is an important one, I think. In 1998, a little game called Grim Fandango comes out, made by LucasArts, created by Tim Schafer. This game, I think, is actually a really good example, and I would be curious to hear other people's takes on this. But personally think Grim Fandango is a good example of someone who is using, you know, lore and folklore and themes from Latinx culture, but incorporating that into some other ones, right? So it's like this is like a sort of noir, like Maltese Falcon game kind of thing, with like, you know, a lot of like saxophones and jazz music and stuff, but it's in a world that is rooted in Latinx and Central American culture specifically. And so, you know, it's an interesting one because I think what I want to sort of cover here is like it's not a game with Latinx characters, but it is a game with Latinx ideas, and they had some big firsts in there, that I think are important to talk about. So this is one of the first games that actually includes Latinx voice acting, and then also, like I said, incorporates Latinx culture, but not in a patronizing, tropey way, right? They're just like using the base material as like a thing to kind of add into another thing to make it interesting. So, you know, would I have loved for this game to be made by Latinx people? Absolutely, that would have been awesome. But for the time, considering where we were, this was a pretty respectful and interesting way to include some different culture without having it just fall into the same sort of tropes. I really liked it. So here's just listen to this and kind of like understand where I'm coming from.
That's a lot of responsibility, Mr. Calavera. What makes you think I've been all that good?
Miss Colomar.
Meche, please.
Meche. I can see it in your face and in your file here, where it says you're entitled to a first-class ticket to... nowhere? What?
Did I do something wrong?
Not according to your bio. It was spotless. At least the part I read was.
I'm not sure I like the implication, Mr. Calavera.
Cool. So it features the main characters are voiced by Latinx people which is awesome. And if you actually read more about this game and the production of it, Tim Schafer actually calls out the fact that Tony Plana, who actually voices Manny Calavera, who's like the main character, he had a bunch of creative input on like different lines and how to kind of like play them up a little bit. And I think there is some stuff that kind of like walks the line, but considering the time and considering the situation, I actually think it's a pretty cool thing to have them be a part of it and represent your culture and the accent and the whole thing in this game. And I think it's done fairly well. I think there is some issues with you know, the idea, and this is a trope that you'll run into later, of like people mixing up their words with like weird Spanglish just to sort of drive home the fact that they are of Latinx descent. But I think they do a pretty good job here, and just in their base voices, they just have the thing, right? You know that they are of Latinx descent, which is pretty freaking cool. So yeah, I'd love to hear more people's thoughts about whether this is like exploitive, or if it's okay. But I think it's more okay than it is exploitive. All right, cool. We got to hurry up now. Okay, so 1998. This one's a good one. In 1998, the Tom Clancy series is happening, and this is, I think, a pretty good example of representation. It's the character's name is Ding Chavez, and this is actually one of the favorites of someone that's on the Latinx and Gaming crew. So shout out to Juan for suggesting this one. I think it's actually a really good one because Ding Chavez is Latinx. It is a mainline protagonist in the game, and is in multiple games and explored in lore outside of the game and books and stuff. And you know, it's the kind of representation that says, hey, you're just a person who is of Latinx descent, who's like good at what you do and awesome, and that's why you belong, and no other prerequisite, right? You're just like, he's just good, and he just happens to be Latinx. And I think that's valid representation. Like, if you just write characters who are driven by proper motives and who aren't steeped in this sort of like tropes of Latinx-ness, and they're just like, hey, I'm Latinx and I do a thing, and and that's not everything that I am. I'm more complex than that. That's pretty good. I like that. So Ding Chavez is definitely one that feels good because he's a main character and you can actually play as him. Okay, 1999. On the other hand, there are other characters that are like this, that are play into the tropes that you don't want. So Carlos Oliveira is, in Resident Evil Nemesis, and I mean, look at him, right? Like, I think he's cool. Yeah, this is actually a jazzed up version of him. I think the original version was, there's no way you could even distinguish. But he's kind of a playboy. He's like pickup artist. He's making unsavory comments towards Jill, but he is an important character in the series. He's Latinx and indigenous. He was part of the communist rebel movement in South America, and then he gets recruited into Umbrella. So I think this initial version is like, and then the updated version was actually pretty cool. I think he still has some of the tendencies that you don't necessarily like the sort of toxic masculinity, but I think he plays a really important role in the new game. I watched a bunch of cutscenes to kind of like get a feel, and he's like a partner. He's someone that's there, who's actually like looked at as good. Unfortunately, he doesn't get a Latinx voice character. I'm pretty sure it's a white dude, but I could be wrong about that. I looked him up and it was kind of ambiguous, but so please prove me wrong on that. But Carlos is cool, but has some problematic stuff. Also, I will say though, the new design of him, right? Like, he's just a cool looking soldier, and he's got some like hair that it's interesting, but it isn't your typical tropes, right? It's just like he's got fluffy hair and he's just letting it loose, which is cool. I'm into it. All right, cool. So now we're getting into some weird territory where things kind of go off the rails. So 2001, Grand Theft Auto 3 comes out, and this is a game that I played and I didn't necessarily understand. I think I felt weird about it, but the treatment of Latinx characters in Rockstar games in general, pretty awful. I don't necessarily, I can't think of any other than, gosh, I'm going to forget his name because he's not in here. Your partner from Red Dead Redemption 2, who's in your crew, who's actually a pretty good character. In 2001, this game comes out and basically like even distills down even more some of the worst stereotypes of Latinx people. And I think not just Latinx, just like every culture out there, right? The triads. Then you have these like Puerto Rican gangs, like literally associated with countries, and they're just bullet fodder. They're just bullet sponges that you shoot. The characters that they actually use in the game are deeply flawed. They're perpetuating terrible stereotypes about drug dealers, them being drug dealers and being sneaky and criminal. The gangs actually were, like I mentioned, were affiliated with like specific countries, which is just like, and then most of the antagonists in all of these games are minority characters, and there's not a lot of redeeming qualities there, unfortunately. So there is a lot of representation in these games. Like if you just look at it kind of blankly, yeah, there's a ton of Latinx characters in these games, but not all representation is created equal. And I think in this case, it's unfortunate, not doing a great job. And that goes for the Red Dead games. I mean, most of the Latinx characters in Red Dead 1 are sneaky. You have Allende and then the other guy who you end up working with to overthrow him, and they both end up being terrible despots. And yeah, it's just not great. We got to hurry. 2006, we're already here. PS3, PS2, gone. Original Xbox, I mean, there are Latinx characters in there, but they're bullet sponges. They're, I guess the only one you could kind of call out is like, what's his name from Time Splitters, but he's like the most ambiguous Latinx character ever, and also voiced by a white guy. So like, okay. So the year's 2006, and this game comes out, and honestly, this is a big one. This is a big one for me. I think for a lot of people, when I asked about this is one of the names that pops up the most. So Dominic Santiago is a pretty exemplary Latinx character. he's a loving family man who's looking for his wife, and who's a confidant to the main protagonist. In some ways, he saves him in the beginning of the game. I mean, he is what you want to see when you have like a complex character who's like driven by plot, by motives that are interesting. He doesn't say any weird Latinx things. He doesn't give you any like weird he's just like a dude who's part of the movement and has a Latinx accent and is voiced by a Latinx voice actor. So he's central to the game. He is part of a moment that we'll play in a second that is like heartbreaking and important, and I think Dom is actually one of the most exemplary characters on this list. So I'll play something.
Never thought it would end like this, huh? Huh, Maria? Dom! No!
I think the volume was kind of low, but it's a sad scene. Dom, earlier in this is the second game, but earlier in this game, he realizes that his wife that he's been searching for actually passed away, and his family hasn't made it, and he goes through this really tough time of trying to figure out what is next. And he gives his life for the main characters, and not in a sort of cheap way, right? Like a lot of Latinx characters are just people of color in games. They're just like, yeah, just shoot them in the head and keep moving. They die, they get a cheap death. It's a way for like to give you some sad, but like not in any way that actually changes the story. Whereas this does. This is where this unit starts like kind of unraveling a bit, which is pretty sad. Okay, so now it's 2006. We covered some female characters. I wanted to call it Isabella Keyes because Isabella Keyes also walks that line in Dead Rising where, she's a super intelligent character. She actually was an antagonist and then turns into like an ally in the game, but like super hypersexualized. Every time she's on the screen, you're seeing her legs or her butt, or it's not great. But she's like a scientist who has the cure, and like you work with her. So unfortunately there aren't many Latinx characters, Latinx female characters, and Isabella is one of them. So I want to call it out, but like, yeah, I mean, yikes. Like there aren't a few, and I'm reaching pretty hard to find some representation for female characters that are meaningful and actually are part of the plot and aren't just like window dressing. All right, 2013. We're almost on time here. You got Mass Effect, and Mass Effect actually had plenty of different kinds of characters, and I think is a super great game. I say what you will about Mass Effect 3. It is kind of a bummer that we had to go all the way to Mass Effect 3 to see some Latinx representation, but James Vega is a pretty cool character. Hardened soldier, but like has depth to him. Has some of that weird like, oh hey, yeah, it's like, it's kind of like cringy Spanglish talk, but still cool. I think a lot of people call this one out as well. He's technically romanceable in the DLC. Sorry if you didn't know that, but you should have got on that. But like not in a weird way, where he's not like a womanizer. You just like have a moment. Yeah. Anyway, and also like James's backstory gets explored in novels and comics, and like he's actually like a main character that like feels good. I like this one a lot. James is cool. Okay, 2013 now. We're just going. 2013 Guacamelee. This one I want to call out because this is actually like straight up, culture, like Mexican culture and folklore in the game, plus luchadors. But I think it actually does a good job, right? Like Juan Aguacate is a heroic character who dies trying to save people. He's an agave farmer, he's a luchador, but he's like the main protagonist of the game. And so there is a way to include these sort of tropes as long as you do so respectfully and if you're exploring the area around it, right? If you're just adding a luchador to your game and it doesn't really make any sense, you're just there, that's one thing. But if you're adding an entire world that's surrounding it, that is also supporting that culture and the ideals, that's interesting. Like that's what I want to see out of Latinx games that are focused on Latinx characters. And I think they could have gone even further with this. Okay, now we're jumping forward. 2016, my goodness. Overwatch. So Sombra's an example. We're going to kind of do a compare and contrast here, because in 2016, Sombra gets introduced into the game. I like the Sombra character because you have to walk this line, and I think a lot of, you know, Latinx female characters that get introduced kind of get thrown into this bucket of like questionable morals, sultry, you know, like sexy, femme fatale, like that kind of weird thing that is like not that cool. Sombra doesn't necessarily have that. I don't think she's super sexualized, right? Like her clothing kind of hides some of her features. The character design is pretty cool. She, you know, like for considering what we were just looking at, I think Sombra is actually a pretty good character. Her background is one layer of her character. Like she has multiple different layers and motives. Her background is like she's a hacker, and she was, you know, kind of impoverished and realized that hacking could actually help her overthrow governments and learn things, but like isn't a thief. You know, maybe has some questionable morals because like worked with Reaper, but like wasn't full on just like criminal. Like you don't look at Sombra and say that's a criminal. And then also was like a huge part of marketing, right? Like she was the second character that was released, had a whole reveal thing, and everyone was really excited about it. It's just a cool character, and also voiced by a Latinx person, which is a theme here that I keep calling out. So after Sombra, I mean, the current, I'm going to call like 2017 and on kind of where we're at right now within games. And there are some other Latinx characters of note. Rico Rodriguez from Just Cause is one. I mean, not necessarily pushing the conversation forward for me as far as like good representation. I think cool to have, but not necessarily like an exemplary one. I also think one that is great from this time frame is are the characters from Life is Strange. I think Life is Strange 2 really delves into a lot of really great topics that are related to, you know, like two Mexican American kids who grow up in the States, and like I don't want to ruin the story. You should just play the game, but I think really good voice acting, important characters that are fun, and there's some like really wonderful quiet moments in the game that are really sweet and nice. You know, brothers, like there's some really cool stuff there to explore. So I would say Life is Strange would make this list. There's the main protagonist from Evil Within, but he's not necessarily Latinx. I mean, he's I think Hispanic actually, which kind of falls out of the purview of what I'm kind of talking about. And then we jump forward to this. So 2020 is an interesting year for characters. I mean, I think leading up to this, there might have been some excitement from myself on these characters, Reyna and Loba from Apex Legends. The problem with these characters is there's another trope that you're sort of running into, right? Which is like the sexy, hypersexualized woman who like has questionable morals, right? Like there's just something kind of cheap about that, and obviously like you have two characters kind of landing right next to each other who do the same thing. Loba's like a criminal, like literally, who like steals things, and Reyna is like super into death, and it's like very sexual. Like, I mean, some of her voice lines in game when she's killing people is like a little weird. Also the purple thing, you know, like it's kind of been done already. So I like these. In theory, in practice, they're characters who are speaking not the way Latinx people speak. They are super sexualized. They have questionable morals, right? Like they're just, you don't know where they stand, and like you know, they have to go and do the bad thing because like that's where they're from. Like it's just like it's kind of boring to me. They do feature Latinx voice actors, which is really good, and I like that. But unfortunately just kind of like just missed the mark for me personally. Now let's talk about the future a little bit. So 2021, Far Cry, the main antagonist, it seems, is a Latinx person. Oh wait, actually he's not. He is black and Italian, and traditionally has played Latinx character, but this is already, we're not off to a great start of 2021. We're not even getting Latinx actors to play character. I mean, I'm sure they'll figure this out in the story, but feeling kind of weird based on what I know about the game, and we'll see how that changes, but not representation and not necessarily a Latinx character. So where do we go from here? The main thing I want to call out here, I think the most important part, and this doesn't necessarily talk directly to the audience that maybe was watching this talk, but we need more game developers of color. If you're hiring people, if you're in charge of putting together teams, get a diverse team. Some of the stuff that you see in games, not to call out specifically, but in the more recent titles, could have been avoided by just having people on the team who live that life, who understand it, who are going to call you out on your bull. There was that whole thing about Cyberpunk and the guy who was just like basically Googling things, and the translations don't add up when under like the literal thinnest amount of scrutiny. And so we can avoid these things by just bringing diverse viewpoints into our workplaces. As a customer, as a person who buys games, support games that make you feel seen. Support games that put you in them and make you feel good about your Latinx culture. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of examples of it, and it's kind of sad. And then make sure those developers know that you're doing the right thing, that they're doing the right thing. The most recent example that I have of like a little thing but is super important is like character creator in Animal Crossing. I mean, I got a fresh fade in Animal Crossing, and I feel good about that. There's skin colors that like sort of match me, and I know we didn't really talk about character creators and that kind of stuff, but like the best way and the easiest way to let me be in the game is let me be in the game and give me good hair options, give me a variety of them that fit different cultures and different ethnicities within Latinx culture. I think it's super important. So yeah, I'm trying to look like me if I can. And then there like what I will say is I could spend an entire talk talking about people who are making cool stuff that aren't necessarily at the forefront of the conversation about games. Mulaka is a great example of this. Created by a company called Lienzo from Mexico. They're using narration from the indigenous language. It's music that is unique to the area. It's they're focusing on a culture that is real and the folklore of it. And so I think we should be, as Latinx people and people from Central and South America, we should be taking the things that are dear to us and using those as ways to make cool stories. I think we just need more of this, and we need more people who are willing to make this stuff, and then also if you're in the industry, willing to support these kind of things. And so you should be seeking that stuff out because it's really important. Okay, questions. We can't do questions because this is pre-recorded, but like I mentioned earlier, leave the stream open. Don't leave PAX's stream. But also, I'm going to be chilling on the Latinx and Games Twitch channel. I'll post it in chat. I'll be lurking. Come ask me questions. Let's talk about this. I'll have plenty of time to answer all the questions possible. I'm ready. Let's talk about it. Call me out. Tell me the ones I missed, all that kind of stuff. If you want to continue this conversation with me, you can find me at Stay Mighty on all the platforms. That's Instagram, that's Twitter. Yeah, come hang out with me and let's work on this together. All right, cool. I think I'm out of time. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. Cheers.
Do you own a VR headset and are interested in asymmetric VR games? We at Full Bean Studio have the game for you! Come try out Operation Armstrong! Sneak around our lunar facilities while your friends keep you hidden from enemy robots. Hopefully. Don't own a VR headset? Find a friend with one and then go play Operation Armstrong. You can direct them through the facilities. Tell them to go left, go right, duck, perform a U-turn where safe, or any combination of senseless noise till they pass out from motion sickness.
You gave me those directions, guys.
Then log in with your smartphone or other device and become the hacker you always wanted to be. Open doors, close doors, distract enemies, crack locks, turn off alarms when your clumsy agent inevitably triggers them. Don't have any friends with VR headsets? Check out our community Discord where you can join other community members or us devs while we play Operation Armstrong. Also, feel free to drop by if you just want to talk game dev, VR, or how the weather is in Australia. Don't forget about our Operation Armstrong level editor. Make entirely custom maps to share over your Steam Workshop and screw your friends over. Alright, enough talk. Let's play.
Hello, welcome to this walkthrough of Operation Armstrong. Up here we've got the TV screen, this is where our agent is. We've got a mobile screen where I'll be doing all my hacking, and we've got the VR view where Halen is sneaking about. So let's get right into it. Let's go.
Alright.
So we're going up to door 4. I'm going to open that, get round behind the obstacle there. Yep, yep. Okay. Yep. You're good. Keep moving. Go into the vent.
Oh no. He was a fast turner.
What? How do you... Okay, go straight there. Just go into the next vent.
Ooh.
I've got the lockdown. Or I'll mess up the lockdown. That's fine. Okay, I'm gonna open door 10, releasing the crawler into the level. If you want to get round to that next next pillar across. I'm choosing when I open this door. Yep, just stay there. It should kind of just wander right next to you. Why not? Just stay. Just. Okay.
Is he coming around?
Leaving you. Go.
Jesus. Alright. What's the code?
Okay. Door 9 is yellow, blue, red. Oh, don't go yet.
Ooh.
Okay.
Oh, alright.
Close that door in his face. I'm just gonna open door 10 as well, so the crawler.
Hello PAX Online, I'm Will Schick with Atomic Mass Games, and today I'm here to show you how to get your miniatures assembled. So let's dive right in and take a look. You'll notice that our miniatures don't come fully assembled. So when you get in a Marvel Crisis Protocol miniatures product or any hobby miniatures game, you're going to see them come on a frame or come in pieces like this here. This is our Thanos from the Marvel Crisis Protocol game. Now, the core tools that you will need in order to assemble your miniatures are, very simply, a pair of clippers and a hobby knife. You can find either of these things at any hobby store or local game store that carries hobby miniatures products. The last thing you're going to need is some kind of adhesive glue. There are two different options. There is plastic miniatures glue, which you can find at hobby stores and works great on hobby products like Marvel Crisis Protocol. There's also classic super glue. Super glue will also work just as well. Each has their own strengths and weaknesses. I like to have both on hand. In order to start with this assembly system, we need to clip these parts off the frame. Now, every miniatures kit typically comes with instructions that shows you how to do the build. You'll notice that each part is numbered, and that helps you identify which part you need to stick to which part. So the first thing to note is that you need to separate each part from the frame. In order to do that, you're going to take your hobby clippers, you're going to hold them in your dominant hand, and you're going to find where the injection ports are for the pieces. So you'll see like the injection ports are here on the bottom of the feet or here on the back of the shoulder pad. The best approach when clipping these off in order to minimize any damage to the piece or any excess material coming off when you clip is to make sure that the flat of the clippers, you'll notice how they're divoted, so they come down at an angle. You want to have the flat of the clippers pressed up as close as possible against the piece that you're about to clip. So you're just going to simply come in here, you're going to clip, and you're going to let it go. So now that I've clipped out my Thanos boots, I need to assemble them. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hobby blade, and I'm simply going to look for any excess material that's left over from clipping the part off the frame. And I just simply want to clean this off. In order to do that, I'm going to put my thumb against the flat of the blade like this, and I'm simply going to use a slight scraping motion as I push against the material. The best practice when assembling the two parts is before you put glue on them, always dry fit. So fit it twice before finishing it off. The next step is to add glue. I'm simply going to run the glue across the edge of the part. Then I'm going to take the other half. Using the dry fitting that I just did, I know how to guide it up. I'm going to put the two parts together. I'm going to press firmly for about 10 seconds. Let's go to the next one. We're simply going to clean. We're going to take our glue. We're going to run around the edge. We're going to continue this for each different part until we wind up with a fully assembled Thanos. And as you move through the different parts of the miniature, you'll start to see the character come together in fantastic fashion. All of it is the joy of the miniatures hobby itself. Once your character is assembled, the last step is to attach them to their base so that they are ready for the painting table. And there you go, guys. A completed Thanos, the Mad Titan miniature, all put together. And that, PAX Online people, is a quick tutorial on how to assemble your own hobby miniatures, starting with our Mad Titan, Thanos. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Be sure to check out more content coming your way during PAX Online, and we will see you on the next one.
In Boyfriend Dungeon, you spend a summer in Verona Beach, California, fighting monsters for money. Except the swords you find in the dungeon can also transform into beautiful men, women, and non-binary people you can befriend or date. You try to get as far as you can in the dungeon each time, but dying's okay, because you can level up too. You need to get stronger to go further. To do that, you'll need a closer relationship with your weapon. You spend the game alternating between fighting in the dungeon and hanging out with your weapons around town. I personally get bored if there's only fighting, but also I get restless if there's too much reading, so we wanted to make a mix of the two. Here, I'm dating Sunder the Talwar, and when we spend enough time together, we'll discover new abilities we can use in combat. Each weapon has a different set of upgrades to find, with choices to make along the way. Different weapons have different preferences for where they want to go on dates, how they want to flirt, and what kinds of gifts they want to receive. They might give you a gift too. There's a variety of different kinds of people/weapons to date in Boyfriend Dungeon, so it's up to you who you want to wield and level up your love. But watch out, there's someone out there kidnapping weapons. We're getting closer to finishing Boyfriend Dungeon now, and we hope people will love it as much as we do. If that sounds like your kind of game, wishlist Boyfriend Dungeon on Steam now.